History of Fingerprinting. Before we go full throttle into fingerprinting, let's start off with a little bit of a historical foundation for characterizing our bodies as means of personal identification. This process is called anthropometry, measuring people's different features and using that to classify or characterize who's who. This system was developed by a guy named Alphonse Bertillon in 1883. His particular system of anthropometry was called for a long time the Bertillon system. The assumption behind the anthropometric system, the Bertillon system, is not just, as we've mentioned in previous lectures, that great portions of anatomical features are fixed, meaning they stay the same your whole life. His is a slight variation on that, which says that your skeletal growth in all people has stopped entirely by age 20. We now know that's not entirely true. There's some nuance to that, of course, but it is actually, on a very, very, very broad scale, more or less true that your skeletal features, your actual bone itself, pretty much stops changing appreciably and growing by the time you're roughly 20 years old. He also thought that everybody's skeletal measurements were 100% unique. He's not a biologist by training or anything. He's really the son of a statistician. So when he's looking at these things, he's not thinking about anatomical variation in any bigger sense. He's not thinking about how easy it is to characterize one ratio versus another very, very close ratio. He just thought the ratios are always different. They may be close, but they are ultimately different. And everybody's ratios, their skeletal measurements, how long their arm is versus their leg versus their shoulders, was 100% unique to that person. Now, there's pros and cons to this approach. The biggest con is that I think it's probably pretty clear to most of us is that it's not like the least bit accurate. It's very, very difficult to measure in any kind of a consistent way, particularly using the methods of the time where it would just be a guy like a jail warden or something with a measuring tape trying to figure out where the base of the guy's arm is and go from there. He's not an anatomist. He doesn't know what he's doing. And so his measurements can be easily thrown off. It might be harder to find certain bony landmarks that you're supposed to look for. People get thinner, people get fatter. People develop tumors or bulges or whatever across their body that can throw off these measurements quite a bit. Not super reliable. Not bad for the time. They don't have a lot to work with. But it's, not actually great. But it is practical. All you need is a dude and a measuring tape, and you can measure these distances with some degree of reasonableness. It's immediately applicable. You can measure it, you can see the numbers, and you can know exactly what it is that you're looking at with very little expert interpretation needed. That same warden, as long as he was also capable of doing some basic math, could figure out if that guy's anthropometric measurements matched that of somebody else that they were looking for. It's cheap as all get out, and it is sort of helpful to a point. You can distinguish two pretty different people from one another based on these measurements. You could pretty easily distinguish me, who is 5'6", from the measurements of my husband, who is 5'10" and has Donkey Kong arms. You could definitely tell the difference between our measurements and to rule out whether or not something was me or him based on these. He also, this guy, interestingly, I mentioned he's the son of a statistician. So he's thinking about this from a numbers perspective, not like an anatomy or a human biology perspective. He also developed techniques for casting impressions, for measuring the force of break-ins, and did some ballistics work as well. These are all sort of characterizing the numbers of these types of phenomena. And in his time, I just like to point this out. I like to remind my students that these scientists are human beings, and it's even though a lot of them end up being lauded after the fact and celebrated as being founders and highly respectable people after the fact, that's not always the case at the time. This guy was regarded as a kook, and people did not want to take him seriously. His numbers held up often enough that it was hard to totally dismiss him. And he ended up testifying in case after case after case and sent a lot of people to jail. But he was regarded as super, super, super weird, and people generally didn't want him around. A diplomat who has mentioned him gave this quote, that he is, quote, certainly not in full possession of his faculties. His moonstruck eyes, his sepulchral voice, the saturnine magnetism made him feel as if he was in the presence of a necromancer. Court argument included that he gave a long list of absurdities. He gave a lot of relevant information in court, but he also rambled on like a crazy dude. He didn't do a lot to improve his credibility. But again, his numbers stood up often enough that it was hard to really keep him away. This is a visual guide for how somebody might go about measuring a person's anthropometrical signals, as they might have been referred to at the time. It's an instructional guide for people who would be doing these measurements but also couldn't read. So you're going to get stuff like their height, the length of their arm. They're going to get their seated height, which will measure their trunk as opposed to the standing, which is their entire body. The circumference of their head. With this one, sorry, over here, number 5 is just the pure width of the head as opposed to the circumference. You have the length of the left middle finger. You have the left forearm length. It's a bunch of different figures that you're getting off of one person. It's not like you're just going in and measuring their arm and calling it a day. The assembly of all of these different unique characteristics, the theory was, should add up to a pretty unique portrait. Now, we know in other stuff that this is not a baseless thing. This is exactly the same principle that we compare class characteristics versus individual characteristics. You often don't have individual characteristics to go by that are, things that are truly individual. But if you have an abundance of class characteristics that all combined, when you look at them all together, can only point one way, that can be used. The amalgamate or the assembly of a lot of different types of class characteristics can be used to point to one specific instance. Not as reliably as if you had an individual, but you know what? You don't get that a lot. This is a twist on that, but it's effectively the same principle. So anyway, let's come back to fingerprinting because that's what this is supposed to be about. So, early fingerprinting, a basic history. Dr. Henry Folds found fingerprints on ancient pottery. He was actually a doctor by training, and he was also a missionary. He found fingerprints on ancient pottery during his anthropology studies. He ended up getting stationed in India and Japan as a missionary and a doctor, one and the same at the time. And in the course of these events, in his observations of a huge swath of people from different cultures and different places, including other missionaries, he came up with a hypothesis that people's fingerprints could uniquely identify individuals. This guy is not a statistician. He is a biologist, an anatomist by training first and foremost. Bertillon brought the numbers. Henry Folds brought some sort of an actual biological basis for this, and an anatomical basis for this. He was later able to successfully use this hypothesis and data he had gathered to support his hypothesis to exonerate somebody who was accused at a break-in and to actually prosecute the appropriate person in an accusation of a break-in at the hospital that he was working at. He published a paper about it in Nature, which is like the whoa, holy cow, esteemed paper for scientific stuff, then and now, in 1880, called On the Skin Furrows on the Hand, which you can read for free. He pitched it to Charles Darwin, who kind of took a look at it and went, neat, and then cast it aside. He did send it along to somebody else who he knew who was interested in fingerprint stuff. This guy's name was Francis Galton. He got that paperwork and ignored it. Darwin went, oh, cool, I know somebody who might like this. Sent it on, forgot all about it until he was reminded of it after the fact. Galton went, what do you know? Cast it aside, didn't think about it for forever, but continued on with his own treatise on fingerprinting called Fingerprints that effectively reproduced all of the same information. Whether or not he explicitly plagiarized is a subject to debate, but he had already been working on this stuff for years beforehand. It seems more likely, or at least as likely, that he was coming up with the same stuff separately and just sort of didn't care what this other missionary dude was coming up with. The treatise on fingerprinting, conveniently named Fingerprints, gave an overview of the anatomy of fingerprints, suggested common patterns that we still use today, and suggested methods for characterizing fingerprints also used today, stuff like dusting for fingerprints and for how to roll the finger properly and things like that. Later on, Darwin and Galton did concede that false was first. They weren't trying to hide that or anything. I personally, again, in the human aspect of thinking of these scientists, find it super amusing that both of these guys saw this in advance and were just like, meh, I don't care. Cool, send it along. In the early 1900s, this is when fingerprinting really took off as a means for identification and use in forensics. Scotland Yard, the esteemed UK investigative detective branch of their police force, adopted fingerprinting as the featured method for identification. They had sort of embraced anthropometry up to that point, not super duper enthusiastic, but they took it because what else are you going to do? They got their hands on fingerprinting and they said, to heck with anthropometry, this works much better, and took it on as their gold standard for identification.